The Crimson Bellow of the Siskiyou. The autumn air in the Siskiyou Mountains of Northern California had already begun to bite with the promise of a harsh winter. For brothers Elias and Ben, it was the last hunting trip of the season, a final attempt to fill their tags and freezers before the snows locked away the high country. Elias, the elder by a decade at 35, was a seasoned outdoorsman, his face a roadmap of sun and wind exposure, his hands calloused from a life of manual labor. Ben, weary and still carrying the last vestiges of collegiate idealism, was more of a philosopher than a hunter, but he cherished these trips with his brother, a tradition that had bound them since their father's passing. Their chosen hunting ground was a remote basin, a good 10-mile hike from the nearest logging road, a place whispered about in hushed tones by the old-timers in the nearby town of Happy Camp. They called it the Silent Basin not for a lack of sound, but for the unnerving way noise seemed to be swallowed by the ancient, moss-draped conifers that choked the valley. It was a place where the usual chatter of squirrels and jays was conspicuously absent, replaced by a profound and unsettling quiet. The first 2 days were uneventful, marked by the rhythmic routine of wilderness life, the pre-dawn chill, the scent of pine and damp earth, the patient stillness of the hunt. They saw plenty of does and yearlings, but the mature black-tail buck they sought remained elusive. On the third evening, as a bruised purple twilight bled across the sky, the first sign of something amiss manifested. A low, guttural cry echoed from the ridge opposite their camp. It was unlike any animal sound Elias had ever heard, a resonant, mournful bellow that seemed to rise from the very bedrock of the mountains. It was a sound that vibrated in their chests, a primal utterance that spoke of immense power and a deep, inconsolable sorrow. Ben, his face pale in the flickering firelight, looked at his brother, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "What in God's name was that?" Elias, though his own heart hammered against his ribs, forced a nonchalant shrug. "Mountain lion, probably. Sound carries funny in these basins." But he knew it was a lie. He had heard the screams of cougars before, the caterwauling shrieks that could curdle a man's blood. This was different. This was deeper, more intelligent, and filled with a terrifying, almost human-like despair. The following day they found the tracks. They were massive, easily 18 inches long, pressed deep into the damp soil near a creek bed. They were undeniably bipedal, with 5 distinct, thick-toed impressions, but what truly chilled them was the irregularity of the gait. The prints were too far apart for a man, one of a giant stature, and one of the feet seemed to drag slightly, a subtle yet significant detail that spoke of an old injury, a persistent limp. Elias knelt, tracing the outline of one of the prints with a trembling finger. The sheer size of it was staggering, but it was the subtle imperfections, the signs of a living, breathing, and wounded creature, that made it truly terrifying. A sense of being watched began to pervade their every moment. The silence of the basin was no longer peaceful, it was predatory. The rust of leaves was no longer the wind, it was the stealthy footfall of something immense. The shadows between the trees were no longer just shadows, they were hiding places for a creature that defied all known biological classifications. On the 5th day, the quiet was shattered by a sound that would be forever seared into their memories. It was a scream, a raw, agonized shriek of pure terror, followed by a wet, tearing sound. It came from the direction of the ridge where they had heard the bellowing cries. Elias and Ben exchanged a look of pure dread. Against their better judgment, they grabbed their rifles and began to move towards the sound, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. As they crested the ridge, the scene that unfolded before them was one of utter carnaging. A mature black bear, easily weighing over 400 pounds, lay eviscerated on a bed of pine needles. Its chest cavity had been ripped open with such force that its ribs were splayed outwards like the petals of a grotesque flower. Its internal organs were strewn across the forest floor, a steaming, bloody tableau that reeked of iron and viscera. But it was the bear's head that was the most horrific. It had been twisted a full 180 degrees, its glass, unseeing eyes staring blankly at its own back. Ben retched, stumbling back and emptying the meager contents of his stomach onto the forest floor. Elias, though his stomach churned, forced himself to examine the scene, his hunter's instincts battling with a primal fear he had never known. The bear's claws, formidable weapons in their own right, were unbroken. There were no bullet wounds, no signs of a struggle with another predator of its kind. There was only one set of tracks leading away from the kill, the same massive, limping footprints they had found by the creek. "We need to leave," Ben stammered, his voice trembling. "Now, Elias, we need to get out of here." Elias, for once in his life, did not argue. The hunter had become the hunted. The apex predator of this forest was not a bear or a mountain lion. It was something else, some far more powerful and infinitely more terrifying. They packed their camp in a frenzy, their movements clumsy and rushed. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind through the pines sent a fresh wave of terror through them. As they began the long hike back to their truck, the feeling of being watched intensified. They could feel unseen eyes on their backs, a malevolent presence that seemed to track their every move. The forest, which had once been a place of solace and beauty for Elias, had transformed into a labyrinth of fear. The familiar call of a bird was now a potential mimicry, a lure to draw them into a trap. The shadows that danced at the edge of their vision were no longer tricks of the light. They were the fleeting glimpses of a monstrous form that was always just out of sight. As dusk began to settle, casting long, menacing shadows across the trail, they heard it again. The deep, guttural bellow. Closer this time, much closer. It was answered by a series of whoop and whistles from the surrounding woods, a complex and intelligent form of communication that sent a fresh wave of ice-cold dread through their veins. They were not being hunted by a single creature. They were being herded. Panic began to set in, a wild primal terror that threatened to overwhelm their senses. They broke into a run, their boots slipping on the loose shale of the trail. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder, the crashing of undergrowth, the snapping of branches, the deep, resonant thud of massive feet hitting the ground too. Suddenly, a massive figure stepped out onto the trail ahead of them, blocking their path. It was immense, easily 9 feet tall, its body covered in long, matted, dark brown hair. Its face was a terrifying mixture of ape and man, with a low, sloping forehead, a wide, flat nose, and deep-set, intelligent eyes that burned with a malevolent, reddish glow in the fading light. Its arms were long and powerfully muscled, ending in thick, dirty fingers tipped with heavy, yellowed nails. One of its legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, the source of the limping gait they had observed in the tracks. But it was the creature's mouth that was the most horrifying. It was pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing a set of large, yellowed teeth, some of which were broken and jagged. A thick, viscous saliva dripped from its jowls, and a low, rumbling growl emanated from its deep chest. For a moment, they were all frozen in a tableau of terror, man and monster locked in a silent, primal standoff. Then, with a deafening, blood-curdling roar that seemed to shake the very trees, the creature charged. Elias, his mind finally breaking free from the paralysis of fear, raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, staggering it for a moment, but seemed to only enrage it further. With a guttural shriek of fury, it swiped at Elias with one of its massive arms, catching him in the chest and sending him flying through the air. He landed with a sickening crunch against a tree, his rifle clattering to the ground. Ben, seeing his brother fall, let out a cry of rage and despair. He fired his own rifle, emptying the magazine into the creature's massive chest. The bullets seemed to have little effect, merely peppering its thick hide and further inflaming its rage. The creature turned its attention to Ben, its red eyes burning with a murderous intent. Ben fumbled to reload, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely handle the cartridges. The creature was on him in an instant, its massive hands grabbing him by the shoulders and lifting him off the ground as if he were a child's doll. Ben screamed, a raw, terrified sound that was abruptly cut off as the creature opened its massive maw and bit down on his head. The sound of crunching bone and tearing flesh was sickening, a wet, sloppy sound that echoed through the silent forest. The creature shook its head from side to side, its powerful jaws making short work of Ben's skull. Blood and brain matter sprayed through the air, painting the surrounding foliage in a grotesque Jackson Pollock of crimson and gray. Elias, his vision swimming in and out of focus, his chest a symphony of agony, watched in horror as his brother was brutally, savagely murdered. He tried to move to get to his rifle, but a searing pain shot through his body and he collapsed back to the ground, his vision fading to black. He awoke to the sound of something being dragged through the undergrowth. He was lying on his side, his body a canvas of excruciating pain. He could taste the coppery tang of blood in his mouth, and every breath was a struggle. He slowly, painfully turned his head, and his eyes widened in horror at the sight before him. The creature was dragging Ben's headless, mutilated body through the woods. It had one of Ben's severed legs slung over its shoulder, and it was gnawing on the raw flesh as it walked. It was a scene of such primal, unadulterated savagery that it defied all comprehension. Elias knew that he was going to die. There was no escape, no hope of rescue. He was alone in the wilderness, at the mercy of a creature that had just butchered his brother with a casual, almost indifferent brutality. But as he lay there, waiting for the inevitable, a strange sense of calm washed over him. The fear was still that, a cold, hard knot in the pit of his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a burning, all-consuming hatred. He would not die cowering and feared. He would die fighting. He slowly, painfully began to crawl towards his rifle, which lay a few feet away. Every movement was an agony, but he gritted his teeth and pushed on, his mind focused on a single, all-consuming thought: revenge. He reached the rifle, his fingers closing around the cold steel of the barrel. He checked the chamber. It was empty. He fumbled in his pockets, his fingers searching for the spare cartridges he always carried. He found them, his numb fingers struggling to load the rifle. He could hear the creature moving around in the darkness, the sound of its heavy, limping footfalls, the wet, tearing sound of it feeding on his brother's remains. The sounds were a gruesome symphony of death, a soundtrack to his own personal hell. He finally managed to load a single cartridge into the rifle. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. He lay in wait, his body trembling with a mixture of pain, fear, and a cold, hard rage. The creature eventually emerged from the darkness, its massive form silhouetted against the pale moonlight. It was holding something in its hand, something that it was raising to its mouth. It took Elias a moment to realize what it was: Ben's severed head. The creature was drinking the blood from the ragged stump of his brother's neck. A wave of nausea and rage washed over Elias, and he almost lost control. But he forced himself to remain calm, to wait for the right moment. The creature turned its head, its glowing red eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, its gaze seemed to lock onto Elias, and he felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror. But the creature seemed to dismiss him, turning its attention back to its gruesome meal. This was his chance. He raised the rifle, his arm shaking, and took aim at the creature's head. He knew that he would only have one shot. He had to make it count. He took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked in his hands, the report echoing through the silent forest. The bullet struck the creature in the side of the head, sending a spray of blood and bone into the air. The creature let out a deafening, agonized roar and stumbled back, dropping Ben's head to the ground. It clawed at the side of its head, its roars of pain and fury echoing through the night. It was wounded, but it was far from dead. It turned its attention back to Elias, its red eyes burning with an even more intense, murderous rage. It charged, its massive form crashing through the undergrowth. Elias tried to reload, but his hands were shaking too violently. He knew that it was over. He had failed. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end, but it never came. He opened his eyes to see the creature lying on the ground, just a few feet from him. It was thrashing around, its massive body convulsing in the throes of death. The bullet had entered its skull and ricocheted, causing massive internal damage. Elias watched, his mind a numb and empty void, as the creature's struggles grew weaker and weaker, until finally, with a last shuddering gasp, it lay still. He had done it. He had killed the monster. He lay there for a long time, his body racked with pain, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of grief, horror, and a strange, hollow sense of victory. He had survived, but at what cost? His brother was dead, his body mutilated beyond recognition, and he himself was grievously injured, with little hope of making it back to civilization. But as the first rays of dawn began to break through the canopy of the ancient forest, a single, all-consuming thought began to form in his mind. He had to tell the world what had happened. He had to warn them about the creature that lurked in the dark, silent places of the world, the creature that had turned his brother into a bloody, headless mess. He had to tell them about the Crimson Bellow of the Siskiyou, and he had to make them believe. For if he didn't, he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he and his brother would not be the last to fall victim to the creature's unholy, insatiable hunger. And the thought of that, more than anything else, was what truly terrified him. It was a fear that would haunt him for the rest of his days, a fear that was far more terrifying than the memory of the creature's glowing red eyes, or the sound of his brother's skull crunching between its powerful, unforgiving jaws. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of what else might be lurking out there, in the deep, dark, and forgotten corners of the world, waiting to be discovered. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would never, ever be the same again. The silence of the wilderness would no longer be a source of peace and solitude. It would be a constant, ever-present reminder of the horrors he had witnessed, a constant, ever-present reminder of the day the world had shown him its true, terrifying face. And he knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the steel of his rifle, that he would carry that knowledge with him to his grave, a grave that he was not yet ready to occupy. He had a story to tell, and he would be damned if he let the world forget it. He would be the voice for the voiceless, the witness to the unthinkable. He would be the man who had looked into the face of a monster and lived to tell the tale. And that, he decided, was a reason to live, a reason to fight, a reason to keep going, no matter how much it hurt. And so, with a groan of pain and a heart full of a grim, terrible resolve, he began the long, agonizing crawl back to civilization. He had a story to tell, and the world was going to listen, whether it wanted to or not.